The sun was sinking behind the jagged line of the mesas, spilling long shadows across the dusty street of Dry Mesa, a town where silence carried more stories than words, and every gust of wind seemed to whisper secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Cole Rayner stepped out of the livery, rope slung across his shoulder, a feed sack weighing down his arm, moving with the ease of a man who had learned long ago not to hurry. His tall frame, lean from years of labor, drew more attention than he wanted, yet he carried himself like someone invisible, someone who wished to pass unnoticed, and perhaps that was the most mysterious part of him. He should have kept walking. He always kept walking. But on that day, just as the evening light broke apart in molten orange, a cry tore through the air, sharp, unsteady, filled with something more than pain. It was the sound of an old woman falling, the sound of dignity collapsing into the dust. Cole turned his head. By the well in the center of town, an elderly Apache woman struggled to rise, her blanket tangled around a splintered board. Her palms pressed against the earth, her face marked by time and endurance. From the porch of the saloon, laughter rose, harsh, cutting, not the laughter of joy, but of cruelty. Men leaned back in their chairs, spitting their contempt, treating her stumble as entertainment. Cole's jaw tightened, his chest heavy with a familiar ache he had tried for years to bury. He had seen this too many times before, humanity discarded like scraps, kindness mocked, pain treated as spectacle. His boots scuffed the ground as he hesitated. "Walk on," he told himself. "Don't look back. Trouble clings to those who stand out." His past already carried shadows he could not erase. But then he saw her hands slipping in the dust, trembling with the effort to rise, and something inside him twisted tight. He thought of his late wife, of her quiet insistence that a man's worth lay in the way he treated those with no power at all. He thought of the long silence that had filled his life since she was gone, and how it had become a hollow echo. The laughter cut through him. He shifted the feed sack to his other arm and crossed the street, every step heavy with decision. The men on the porch quieted, their smirks fading into watchful sneers. Cole crouched beside the woman, his voice low, steady, soothing as a stream after rain. "Easy," he murmured, offering his hand. Her eyes, sharp even in their age, searched his face for a moment, then accepted. His grip was firm but gentle, lifting her back onto her feet, steadying her with a strength born not just of muscle, but of quiet resolve. She stood, her dignity restored for that small moment. "You are not like the others," she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. Cole tipped his hat, saying nothing, for words often drew more danger than silence. Still, the weight of her gaze lingered. As though she had seen into the place inside him he kept hidden from the world. He walked away, but the laughter that had once jeered now fell silent, replaced by a heavy awareness that his simple act had changed something. That night, far from town, Cole built his campfire under the stretch of endless stars. The flames licked at the cold, and the coyotes sang somewhere in the hills, but the silence pressed heavier than usual. He thought of the woman's eyes, of the sharp cruelty in the town, of his own hand extended in defiance of indifference. He told himself it was nothing, a passing moment, yet the ember of it glowed in him, unsettling and strangely healing, as if compassion itself had found its way back into the cracks of his heart. The crackle of the fire was steady, comforting, almost like a pulse reminding him that even in a fractured world, warmth could be chosen. He closed his eyes, the memory of laughter and cruelty still near, but beneath it another memory stronger, the faint tremor of an old woman's hand grasping his, clinging not to a man, but to the proof that kindness still lived. It stirred something deeper than loneliness, something that felt like the first breath after drowning. In that fragile quiet, when the night seemed to lean close and listen, a sound rose from the darkness beyond the fire. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, brushing against the dry grass. Cole's hand moved to his revolver, though he didn't draw, only resting his palm on the worn grip as the shadows shifted. From the dark emerged a figure wrapped in a blanket, the same old woman, her eyes glinting with the firelight. Behind her, another form lingered. Younger, graceful, and carrying an aura that unsettled the stillness of the night. The fire burned brighter as she stepped forward, and Cole's breath caught in his chest. The old woman's voice carried softly, like a secret meant only for him. "You helped me. I bring someone." And then, with a quiet certainty that would change everything, she added, "My daughter." And just like that, Cole's world, carefully kept, built on solitude and silence, shifted. What began as a single act of compassion now unfolded into something larger, something unknown, something dangerous, yet alive. And in that moment, with the stars sharp above and the fire painting her face in gold, Destiny sat down at his campfire. So if you find yourself drawn to the quiet courage of a man who never asked to be a hero, if you feel the healing warmth in stories where love rises from dust and loneliness, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in a comment, and subscribe. Because some tales deserve to be carried forward, not just as stories, but as reminders that even in the harshest deserts of life, kindness can plant seeds that grow into love. The night deepened, the silence pressed close, and Cole Rayner realized that his life was no longer his alone. It had only just begun to change. The fire still glowed low when the dawn pressed its pale light across the horizon, soft grey, stretching toward blue. Cole stirred from restless sleep, the kind where dreams lingered like smoke and refused to clear. He pushed himself upright, rubbing the back of his neck, and then remembered with a jolt that he was not alone. The old woman sat wrapped in her blanket near the tree line, her eyes half closed but always watchful, sharp as the edge of flint. Closer to the fire, the girl moved with a quiet grace, crouching low, feeding the embers with kindling until sparks leapt again into flame. Her hair slipped forward like a curtain, black and gleaming in the dim morning, hiding most of her face as she worked. But even from where he sat, Cole noticed the steady rhythm of her movements, practiced and sure, as though she belonged to firelight and silence alike. His camp, which had always been filled only with the sounds of wind and horses, now carried the faint hush of her presence, a new note added to the lonely song of his mornings. It was strange and unsettling to feel the air itself warmer. "Morning," he said finally, his voice rough from sleep. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his for an instant before she nodded once and went back to stirring the ashes. The old woman adjusted her blanket, not speaking. Cole rose, pulled on his boots, and poured himself water from the bucket, splashing it across his face. The chill cut through his weariness, but when he looked up, she was watching him again, the girl, her eyes calm and unreadable, like a pool of water untouched by wind. "You plan on staying past breakfast?" he asked, his tone clipped, though softer than he intended. "If you let us," the old woman replied simply, as if the matter had already been settled. Cole felt something press heavy against his chest. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't invited it. And yet, last night, he hadn't sent them away either. He had given them fire, food, and safety, things a man like him should guard close. Now, it seemed, the weight of that choice sat squarely on his shoulders. The girl, her name not yet known to him, rose gracefully, reaching for a small tin cup and pouring water into the ashes until smoke curled upward. She moved as though she had done this many mornings before, as if his camp had always been hers. Her quiet presence filled the space without noise or demand, and that silence felt strangely healing. Like balm on wounds, he never spoke aloud. "You got a name?" he asked finally, more roughly than he meant, because her calmness unsettled him. She looked at him briefly, surprised, and then answered in a voice soft but sure. "T." "Cole," he said in return, though he knew by the way her eyes flickered that she had already known. The old woman shifted, her sharp gaze never leaving him. "You helped when others would not. You are different." Cole's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He hadn't wanted to be seen. He hadn't wanted to be remembered. Yet here they were, seeing him more clearly than the town ever had. Breakfast was simple, cornmeal crisping in the skillet, coffee brewed darker than he preferred. But it was shared, and that small act carried a weight of its own. She moved easily through his supplies, her hands steady, her shoulders relaxed, as if she had always known where each thing belonged. The old woman ate slowly, her eyes thoughtful. Cole chewed in silence, watching the girl without meaning to, noticing the way her braid loosened when she bent forward, the curve of her wrist as she stirred the pan. He told himself it was nothing, but the air carried something new, something unspoken, pressing closer with every moment. When the meal was done, she cleaned the skillet without being told, rinsing it with the last of the water, her movements efficient, graceful. Cole rose, went to saddle his horse, trying to ignore the weight of their presence. Yet when he turned, they were still there, sitting by the fire as if waiting for him. "You can't just sit here all day," he muttered, more to himself than them. The old woman's voice was calm, certain. "We go where you go. You gave us fire. That is the deal." Cole cursed under his breath, but when he looked back, T's eyes were on him. Not pleading, not begging, simply steady. It was the kind of look that demanded no words, yet left no room to refuse. His chest tightened with something he didn't want to name. "You work?" he asked, voice clipped. T nodded once. "Then you pull your weight. I don't run a charity camp." The old woman's gaze softened with something like approval, and T stood, gathering camp gear without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for the command. Cole mounted his horse, the leather creaking under his weight, and started north toward his land. Behind him he heard the sound of their footsteps, 2 shadows now bound to his own. The trail stretched before them, dust rising under the hooves, the sky wide and endless. He told himself he was making a mistake, that bringing them meant trouble, whispers, danger. But when he looked back and saw T walking steady beside her mother, the sunlight touching her hair, her torn dress shifting with each step, something stirred inside him, something he thought long buried. By the time they reached his land, with its weathered cabin and leaning fences, the sun was high. Cole dismounted, his eyes restless, waiting for them to falter, to hesitate, to turn back. But T walked past him with quiet confidence, knelt by the water trough, and washed her hands as though she belonged here. Cole stood frozen, the saddle heavy in his arms, until he let out a slow breath and turned away. That night, when the cabin filled with the sound of her moving softly by the fire, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the faint trace of her hair, Cole realized the silence he had once thought his only companion was no longer silence at all. It was something warmer, something alive, something dangerously close to healing. And though he told himself this was temporary, just until they moved on, he knew deep down that nothing in his world would ever be the same again. The night settled gently over the cabin, the fire glowing steady while the wind whispered against the walls. Cole lay on his bedroll, staring at the rafters, listening to every sound, the shifting of the horses outside, the old woman's even breathing, and, most of all, the soft movements of T near the hearth as she banked the coals. The smell of smoke, mixed with the faint trace of her hair, lingered in the air, clinging to him in a way he could not shake. He told himself the unease in his chest was nothing more than the strangeness of sharing space again, yet the truth pressed deeper. It had been years since he had allowed another presence this close, and now the silence of his cabin no longer felt like loneliness, but something changing, something that made him restless and alive in equal measure. At dawn, he rose before the others, stepping outside into the cold air, breaking ice on the trough, pouring water for the horses. The earth smelled sharp, clean, as though the morning itself carried a kind of healing. When he returned inside, T was already awake, kneeling by the fire with her hair braided back, her hands patting rough biscuits into shape from the flour she had found. The sight stopped him where he stood. She moved like someone who had always belonged, her rhythm blending seamlessly with the space that had been his alone. He watched the curve of her wrist, the steadiness of her expression, the quiet assurance in her every motion. "You cook like you've done it a while," he said at last, hanging his coat on the peg. "I cook for my people," she replied simply, her voice clear but calm. Her words stirred something unspoken in him. He knew the cost of people, the ache of losing them, the emptiness that followed. He poured water into his hands, splashing his face, but when he sat at the table, his gaze returned to her. "You left them to come here," he said, though it sounded more like a question than he intended. T did not falter. She placed the biscuits on the pan, setting them near the flame. "My people are gone from this valley, pushed north. Only my mother and I remained." Her voice held no self-pity, only truth, and it pressed into Cole like a knife of memory. He thought of the winter he buried his wife with his own hands, the ground frozen, the silence afterward more unbearable than the grave itself. For a heartbeat, he nearly told her, but the words caught in his throat. He was not ready to bear that wound, not to someone he had known for so short a time. Yet the way she looked at him, steady, unwavering, made him wonder if she already knew more than he wanted revealed. Breakfast was eaten in silence, but it was not empty silence. The warmth of the biscuits, the steady crackle of the fire, and the unspoken trust hanging between them created a stillness that felt more like peace than distance. When the meal ended, Cole rose, setting a task before her. "You'll work," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "The fence line's weak. You can help." She nodded once, and in that nod was no hesitation. They rode out together, the morning stretching wide across the valley. Cole led her to the south fence, where rails sagged and wire pulled loose. He handed her nails, steadied the post while she held the rails. Her hands were strong, her movements certain, and when sweat dampened her hair despite the cold air, he caught himself watching the muscles in her arms as they flexed, the curve of her shoulders beneath the torn dress. He forced his focus back to the hammer, but each time their hands brushed as they worked, the contact echoed deeper than it should. When the sun rose higher, they paused beneath the thin shade of a cottonwood. Cole passed her the canteen, their fingers brushing again. "Where'd you learn to mend fence?" he asked. "My father," she said, lifting the water to her lips. "He was a horsebreaker. I went with him." "What happened to him?" Her eyes lowered briefly, then steadied again. "He died last winter. Sickness." The words sank heavy between them. Cole nodded slowly, jaw tight. He knew the weight of winter loss too well. For a moment, he thought of telling her about his wife, the nights he lay beside her as fever stole her breath, the emptiness afterward. But grief was a language he was not ready to speak aloud. Instead, he only said, "I'm sorry," his voice low, rough, carrying more truth than apology. They worked until the light began to slant gold across the hills. Returning to the cabin, tea moved naturally through the space, stirring the coals, gathering wood, beginning supper as though she had always belonged there. The old woman watched in silence, her sharp eyes glinting, as if she saw deeper into Cole's thoughts than he wished. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, but his gaze kept drifting to tea, to the way her hair slipped loose as she bent, to the calm certainty in her movements. When she finished mending a tear in his shirt from the week before, she folded it carefully, placed it beside him without a word. Cole lifted his eyes, truly looking at her then. And in that moment, for the first time since his wife's death, he felt the raw ache of wanting something more than solitude. The old woman's voice broke the silence, low but certain. "You have no woman. My daughter needs a man who is not afraid." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. T did not look up, but Cole saw the faint curve at the corner of her mouth, the smallest sign that she had heard. His chest tightened, his breath uneven. Abruptly, he rose, setting the rifle back in its rack. "We'll talk about that another time," he muttered, stepping outside into the sharp night air. The stars glittered hard and cold above, the kind of sky that made a man feel small. Yet when Cole looked back at the cabin, the glow of fire through the window spilled warmth against the dark. For the first time in years, his home no longer felt like a fortress of silence, but like the beginning of something alive. Inside, T's laughter murmured softly with her mother's voice, blending with the fire's crackle, and Cole stood long in the cold, listening. Something was shifting, undeniable. And though he had not chosen it, he felt it rooting deep, as if the healing he never sought had already found him. The storm rolled in from the hills by late afternoon, a restless sky heavy with grey and the scent of rain sharp in the air. Cole had been working in the corral, his hands busy on a gate hinge, while T gathered wood near the tree line. Every so often his eyes drifted toward her, as if pulled against his will, watching the way her braid loosened in the wind, the way she moved with quiet certainty. When the first drops began to fall, she lifted her face to the sky as though she could read it, then turned toward the cabin. Cole called after her, his voice carrying over the restless air. "Storm's going to break." She nodded, bare feet stirring dust as she hurried toward the porch, the first hard rain striking just as he pulled the door closed behind them. Inside, the cabin breathed warmth, firelight flickering against the walls, the smell of wet earth drifting through the cracks. T pushed her damp hair back from her face, strands clinging to her cheek, water sliding down the hollow of her throat. Cole handed her a rag, his fingers brushing hers. "You'll catch cold like that," he muttered, his voice low, rougher than he meant. She took it without protest, blotting at her arms, though the thin fabric of her dress clung to her shape, outlining every curve. He turned away quickly, stoking the fire with sharper movements than necessary, though the heat crawling up his neck betrayed him. The storm pounded against the roof, filling the small space with a constant roar. T moved nearer to the fire, the flames catching on her damp skin, painting her in gold and shadow. Cole told himself to busy his hands, to fix a latch or mend the tack, but his gaze kept straying back to her. She crouched to stir the pot, her blanket slipping from her shoulder, and when she lifted her eyes suddenly, their gazes locked. For a long heartbeat, neither looked away, the air charged, alive, dangerous in its pull. Cole was the first to break it, rising abruptly, crossing to the pegs by the door. He offered her his hat. "When you fetch wood or water, keeps the rain out of your face," he said, his tone clipped, trying for distance. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers grazing his again. The brim shadowed most of her face when she put it on, yet it suited her in a way that stirred something he could not admit. He turned back to the fire, forcing himself into stillness, though every breath felt heavier. They settled into a rhythm as the storm raged. Cole worked on a cabinet latch, his tools clinking steady, while T cooked beans and bread, moving around the cabin with the quiet ease of someone who already knew her place. The old woman sat wrapped in her blanket near the hearth, her sharp eyes softened by approval, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. When supper was ready, they ate together at the table, rain drumming overhead like a steady hymn. Cole realized then how long it had been since he had shared such a simple thing. Bread passed hand to hand, warmth rising from the fire, voices soft in the glow. For the first time in years, the walls of his home did not feel like barriers but shelter, not emptiness but belonging. Afterward, T rose quietly, taking his shirt, the one she had mended, and hanging it near the fire to finish drying. When she turned back, Cole was watching her. His voice was quiet, roughened by something he didn't want to name. "You don't have to do all this." Her eyes met his, calm but steady. "I want to." The words lingered in the air, carrying more weight than the storm outside. Cole felt something shift deep inside, as if a wall long built against grief and silence had cracked. He nodded once, busying himself with the coffee pot, though the warmth that spread through him was not from the fire. Later, as night deepened, he spread his bedroll as he always had, but when he glanced toward her, he saw T near the hearth, hair loose now, the firelight glinting off its strands. She was speaking softly with her mother, their voices a murmur, like the steady healing rhythm of rain. Cole lay back, hat over his face, trying to ignore the sound of her laughter threading through the storm. Yet sleep did not come easily. Each time the fire popped, he thought of the way her eyes had met his, the quiet certainty in her voice when she said she wanted to stay. When dawn finally broke, the storm was gone, leaving the air crisp, the earth damp, carrying the clean scent of renewal. Cole stepped outside, the horizon washed in light. Behind him he heard the door open, her footsteps soft on the porch. T brushed down the horse, her hands gentle, her braid falling loose in the morning wind. Cole turned, his chest tightening at the sight. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone against the world. He felt the beginning of something fragile, unspoken, and healing. Something that bound him to the land, the cabin, and to her in a way he could no longer deny. The trail into town still waited, the eyes of others sharp with judgment. But Cole knew that whatever storm rose ahead, he was no longer facing it in silence. And that realization settled into him like warmth after cold, like the quiet miracle of light after a long night. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp, the sky, an endless blue, stretched wide above the valley. Cole saddled his horse with steady hands, though his chest carried a heaviness he could not shake. Supplies were running low, nails, flour, kerosene, and there was no avoiding the trip into town. He had delayed for days, perhaps longer than he should have, because the thought of walking those streets with T at his side filled him with a weight that had nothing to do with goods or coin. Yet hiding her away was no answer either. If she was to stay, the town would have to see her, and he would have to face what came of it. T stood brushing down the mare, her movements calm, her braid swinging softly with each stroke. When he told her his plan, her dark eyes lifted to his. "We come?" she asked, her tone steady, not pleading, but sure. Cole hesitated, breath caught, then nodded once. "Stay close to me. No wandering." She inclined her head in agreement, and it was settled without another word. By mid-morning they rode down the trail, the old woman wrapped in her blanket behind T, Cole riding at the front. The land unfurled before them, washed clean by the storm, the earth dark with damp and smelling of renewal. Cole's gaze swept the horizon, alert out of habit, but beneath his watchfulness, thoughts churned. What whispers would follow? What danger might stir? Still, the sound of T's mare moving steady behind him carried something like comfort, a rhythm that steadied the tightness in his chest. When they reached Dry Mesa, the town was alive with wagons and voices, the clang of the smithy, the murmur of men outside the saloon. Cole dismounted first, tying his horse to the rail, then lifted T's mother carefully down. The air shifted as eyes turned, voices quieting. The sight of an Apache woman, young and proud, standing beside Cole Rayner, was enough to draw sharp stares and muttered words. He ignored them, his shoulders squared, his voice flat as he offered a curt morning to Mr. Dawes inside the mercantile. The shopkeeper's expression was cautious but polite, his eyes darting between Cole and T before settling on the shelves. Cole gathered what he needed, flour, salt, coffee beans, while T followed at his side. She moved with her chin high, her shoulders straight, not flinching from the stares that followed. She walked the aisles as though daring anyone to question her right to be there, and Cole felt a pull in his chest at the quiet courage of it. They were nearly finished when the door banged open. 2 ranch hands stumbled in, already half drunk though the sun was still high. Cole recognized them at once, the same men who had mocked T's mother in the street days before. Their laughter carried the same sharp edge as then, cruel and careless. "Well, look what we got here," one said, his eyes narrowing on T. "Cowboy brought his little prize to town." The other leaned closer, his grin mean. "Ain't she pretty?" What did you pay for her, Raina?" The words struck hot through Cole's chest. He set the sack of flour down with deliberate calm, then turned to face them. "Back off," he said, his voice even but iron beneath. The first man smirked, stepping closer. "Just talking, Cole. No harm in looking." T stood still, her hands at her sides, eyes fixed on him as though waiting to see what he would do. That look, steady, trusting, settled the matter. In 2 strides, Cole closed the distance, planting himself between her and the men. His hand hovered near the revolver at his hip, his stance calm but unyielding. "I said back off. She's with me." The smirk faltered. The second man's gaze flicked to the gun, then away. "No need to get riled," he muttered, tugging his partner toward the door. The first man spat a curse under his breath, but followed. The door slammed behind them, leaving silence heavy in their wake. Cole exhaled slowly, turning to T. "You all right?" She nodded once, her voice quiet but steady. "Yes." Yet her dark eyes glimmered, not with fear but something warmer, a flicker that made his chest tighten. They paid for the supplies and stepped back into the sun. The street felt lined with eyes, but Cole ignored them, lifting T into the saddle with steady hands before mounting his own horse. They rode out of town without looking back, the dust rising behind them. The trail home stretched long, but the silence between them was different now. Charged, alive, no longer the silence of strangers, but of something unspoken, waiting to break. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had lowered, painting the hills in copper light. T built the fire, her hands moving sure and calm, while Cole hung his coat on the peg. "You stand for me today," she said softly, her voice carrying across the small space. Cole glanced at her, then away. "Wasn't about making a show. Was about keeping you safe." "You made a show," she murmured, her tone gentler, not accusing but thoughtful. He turned to face her fully. "You got a problem with that?" Her lips curved faintly, the smallest of smiles. "No." Something inside him settled then, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For days he had held back, walls built high against grief and memory, but with those simple words the wall cracked. That night, as they sat by the fire, her hair loose across her shoulders, her gaze meeting his without flinching, Cole felt the truth pressing hard against his chest. For the first time in years, he was not a man alone. He was something more, something fragile, dangerous, and healing all at once. And though he tried to resist it, the current was already pulling him deeper. The night stretched quiet, the fire glowing steady, and Cole knew that silence would never be the same again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm so unfamiliar to Cole that it unsettled him almost as much as it soothed. The fences still sagged in places, the cattle still needed driving, and the wind still swept down from the hills, sharp with dust and cold. But there was movement in the cabin now that was not his alone. He would wake to the quiet sound of T tending the fire, her mother murmuring soft prayers in a tongue older than the land itself, and for the first time in years, mornings carried warmth before the sun even rose. They worked side by side in the fields, mending rails and pulling weeds where the wild growth threatened the posts. Cole handed her nails. She braced the wood steady with strength that surprised him. When sweat dampened her temples and her braid came loose, strands clinging to her cheek, he had to force his gaze away, telling himself to focus on the task. Yet each brush of her hand against his when she passed him a tool left a spark in the air, something quiet but undeniable. At midday, they stopped by the creek. T knelt by the water, cupping it in her palms, droplets slipping down her skin. Cole crouched nearby, his reflection wavering in the current, though his eyes kept drifting to her. "You always this quiet?" he asked at last, his voice roughened by more than dust. She lifted her gaze, dark eyes steady. "You like quiet," she answered simply. It disarmed him more than a sharp retort ever could. He huffed a laugh, short and almost surprised. "Most folks talk too much." Her lips curved faintly. "You talk when you need to." Cole studied her, the ease with which she read him unsettling but strangely healing. He realized then how long it had been since someone had seen him clearly, without judgment, without demand. The silence that followed was not heavy, but calm, like the creek itself, carrying something clean through both of them. When they returned to the cabin, her mother sat outside, mending a blanket in the waning light. Her sharp eyes flicked between them, as if measuring the air, and then she said plainly, "You work well together." Cole only grunted, but he didn't deny it. Inside, T moved with quiet assurance, stirring the pot, reaching for wood, her steps light but sure. Cole sat at the table, knife in hand, pretending to sharpen the blade, though his attention wandered to her every motion. When she brushed past him, her hip grazed his arm. He froze, heart pounding, but she didn't pause, didn't apologize. She moved on as if the touch was natural, and in that small silence something inside him shifted. That night, after the chores were done, Cole leaned on the porch rail, staring out at the dark. He could hear her inside, humming softly as she cleaned, her voice a thread of sound weaving through the cabin. The stars burned cold overhead, yet the sound filled him with warmth, a healing note he hadn't known he needed. He stayed outside longer than he should have, struggling against the tide that was pulling him closer to her with each passing day. When he finally stepped back in, she was near the fire, hair unbound, beadwork glinting in her hands. She looked up, and for a moment their eyes met and held. He asked, his voice quieter than he intended, "You ever think about leaving?" "No," she said simply, her gaze steady. "Not even after what happened in town?" She shook her head once, braids slipping loose. "I feel safe here." The words pressed into him harder than any wound, loosening something deep. He had built his home as a fortress, a place to keep the world out. Yet hearing her say she felt safe within it made him realize he had been building it for more than his own solitude. Her mother shifted in her chair, her voice calm and certain. "She stays because you let her, because you fight for her." T did not look away this time. Her dark eyes stayed on his, unwavering. Cole's chest tightened until he had to rise, muttering something about checking the horses, escaping into the night air. But even outside, leaning on the corral rail, he could still feel the weight of her gaze, the truth of her words lingering in him. When he returned, the cabin was quiet. Both women settled near the fire, blankets drawn up, breathing even. Cole lay on his bedroll, staring at the ceiling, the sound of her soft breath steadying the air. He told himself he could still keep this contained, still hold back. But the truth was clear. The silence no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to them now, woven together with firelight, trust, and something tender that was already blooming, fragile and unstoppable. By morning, when T stepped outside with a coil of rope over her shoulder, her torn dress patched at the seams, Cole realized with a jolt that she looked as though she had always been part of this place. And as he watched her walk toward the corral, his heart tightened with the quiet, dangerous knowledge that he no longer wanted to imagine the land without her in it. The warning came quietly, carried on the hooves of a lone rider from town. Cole was stacking hay near the barn when he saw the man approach, dust trailing behind him in the fading light. The rancher, wiry and grey-moustached, reined in his horse with unease. "Rayner," he said, voice low, "some of the boys didn't take kindly to how you handled things at the mercantile. Word is they're fixing to ride out here, make a point of it." His eyes darted toward the cabin, toward the faint glow of firelight in the window. "Best be ready." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving silence heavier than before. Cole stood a long moment, jaw tight, the weight of the warning pressing deep. When he stepped inside, the air was warm with the scent of beans cooking. Tea stirred the pot with quiet grace, her mother mending a shawl by the fire. Cole closed the door behind him, his voice steady but grim. "Word is some men might come out here. They don't like being shown up." T paused, her hand stilling on the spoon, her eyes lifted to his, calm though shadowed. "They come for me?" "They come because they're cowards," Cole said flatly. "But they might use you as the excuse." The old woman nodded slowly, as if she had already foreseen it. "Then we stay ready." Cole checked the rifle by the door, his movements deliberate. He cleaned it, loaded it, set it back within reach. The room fell into silence, broken only by the pop of the fire and the wind rattling faintly against the shutters. Outside, the night thickened, the sky studded with cold stars. Yet inside the cabin there was warmth, a fragile healing flame born of their shared presence. Later, long after he should have been asleep, Cole lay awake, listening to the breath of the horses, the faint creak of wood. Then he heard another sound, the soft shift of floorboards. He sat up, hand on the revolver, but it was not trouble. T stood near the hearth, her blanket drawn around her shoulders, her hair spilling loose, her face half-shadowed in firelight. "You all right?" Cole asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. "I cannot sleep. The wind reminds me of what the man said. Maybe they come tonight." Cole pushed himself to his feet, crossing toward her. His voice was firm. "They won't. But if they do, they'll answer to me first." Her gaze lifted to his, dark eyes searching his face. "Why do you do this for us?" The question struck deeper than he expected. He looked down for a moment, his voice rough when it came. "Because it's right. Because you deserve better than what they gave you. And because—" He faltered, shaking his head, then finished quietly, "Because I don't want to see you hurt." For a long moment she stood very still, then stepped closer, so near the fire painted her skin in gold. Her hand rose, light as a breath, brushing against his forearm. "You are different," she whispered. Something in his chest loosened at those words, a knot he had carried for years beginning to unravel. Slowly, carefully, he set his hand on her shoulder. She did not pull away. The air between them grew warm, charged, as though the silence itself leaned toward them. "Go back to sleep," he said, though his voice was unsteady. "You're safe here." But she did not move toward her bed. Instead, she lingered a heartbeat longer, her gaze steady on his, until he felt himself caught in something deeper than choice. He stepped back, breaking the current before it consumed him, his voice rough. "Tomorrow, I'll ride the ridge. Make sure no one's coming this way." Her eyes lingered on him, then she nodded, settling again beside her mother. Cole remained by the fire long after, staring into the flames, his heart pounding with truths he could not yet name. When dawn came bright and clear, no riders appeared on the horizon, yet the air carried the tension of a storm still waiting. T worked in the yard, hanging strips of cloth for bandages in case trouble came. Cole watched her from the porch, his chest heavy. She turned once, meeting his gaze, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt the weight of trust settle on him like a cloak, heavy but strangely healing. Through the day, as they worked the stock, their hands brushed more than once. Each time, neither pulled back. And that night, as the cabin glowed in firelight, the silence between them was no longer burden, but a bond, something alive, waiting to bloom, fragile and certain as the dawn to come. The tension that had lingered like a shadow finally broke one quiet evening when the chores were finished and the fire burned steady inside the cabin. The day had been long. Fence mended, cattle tended, wood stacked high for colder nights. But instead of weariness, Cole felt something else thrumming in his chest, an energy restless and alive. T moved about the cabin with practiced ease, setting the pot to simmer, her braid loose now, strands of hair catching the glow. Her mother sat near the hearth, silent but watchful. Her sharp eyes softened as though she already knew what was about to unfold. Cole sat at the table, his rifle cleaned and put away, his knife sharpened, his hands idle for once. He watched T without meaning to, the way her shoulders shifted as she stirred, the curve of her wrist, the calm determination in her face. When she turned suddenly, their eyes met, and the space between them felt charged, as though the fire itself leaned closer. He rose slowly, crossing to her side, his voice low. "You sure about this? About staying here? With me?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, her voice steady. "I'm sure." The words struck him harder than he expected, loosening something deep inside that had been bound tight for years. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his thumb grazing her skin. She did not flinch. She did not look away. Instead, she breathed deeper, as though the touch steadied her. Cole leaned down, his lips finding hers, slow at first, then deepening when she answered, her hands rising to rest against his chest. His heart thudded hard beneath her touch, years of silence breaking in that one moment of closeness. When they drew back, her lips curved faintly. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice like the softest healing thread through the quiet. Cole let out a rough breath, half a laugh, and pressed his forehead to hers. "We take this slow. I don't want to hurt you." "You won't," she said simply, with the certainty of someone who had already chosen her path. Behind them, her mother pulled her blanket tighter, her gaze approving, though she spoke no word. The firelight painted the cabin in gold and shadow, and for the first time since his wife's death, Cole felt not just alive, but whole. The silence between them was no longer heavy with grief, it was filled with warmth, with promise, with the healing rhythm of two hearts learning to beat together. The nights grew colder after that, frost silvering the fields, but the cabin stayed warm. T wore his flannel shirt over her dress, sleeves rolled at the elbows, moving through the rooms with quiet grace. She mended his clothes, cooked beside him, rode the ridges with him, her presence stitched into every corner of his days. The land felt different now, not empty, not hostile, but alive with the pulse of belonging. Even the old grief, though it still lingered, no longer cut so deep. It was softened by her laughter, healed by her touch, eased by the simple act of sharing bread by the fire. Cole had not looked for this. He had not asked for it. Yet as he stood one evening at the porch rail, tea at his side, her hand slipping into his, he understood that love does not wait for permission. It arrives like rain on parched earth, sudden and unstoppable, turning silence into music, solitude into home. And though the world beyond still whispered, though danger still lingered at the edge of the hills, within these walls there was peace, there was healing, there was love strong enough to endure. So, if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of the warmth that can grow even in the harshest places, if it stirred hope that healing is always possible, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. Because sometimes the simplest tales of kindness and courage are the ones that teach us most, that even in the dust and silence of a lonely valley, love can take root, and from that seed, life begins again.